Okay, so the issue here is how to overcome the two main disadvantages of democracy. And the first is that the people will select representatives who are not very competent. That could be a big problem. How to reduce the risk of that happening, or how to stop incompetent representatives from having too much political impact. Well, for him, the solution is, in some sense, quite simple in theory, but of course in practice it's very hard to implement. But if you look at those who have expertise in law and in administration, use examinations, meritocratic mechanisms to select the civil servants who are supposed to implement the decisions of elected leaders, then that is a way to ensure that the policies will be good policies. So the elected representatives don't have to do much. The people, you vote for them, 通过他们选他们的代表，但是这些代表不一定要决定所有的问题，他们可以决定最抽象的原则，比如说我们要离开欧盟 ，okay? We want to we want to leave the European community. How do you do that? It's very complicated. Who decides on those details? How to implement the civil service, who are very brilliant, chosen by meritocratic mechanisms such as examinations. That's the basic idea here. The task of Parliament, these guys, the House of Commons, is to watch and control the government rather than to formulate legislation. The details of the legislation, these guys do it. The framing of legislation is a task for experts. These guys are experts. 这是专家，而不是这些人，对不对？ And the administration is to be left to professional administrators. 这些官员，他们可以决定怎么实行这些很抽象的原则。所以理论上，他们决定的，有一些权利，当然最重要的权利，我们的国家应该怎么做，将来应该怎么做，有一些抽象的原则。但是这些人的非常重要，这些人会考虑比较聪明的方式来实行这些很抽象的原则。So drafting legislation, these guys can be made into a specialized occupation, performed by commission, which receives instruction about the principles of the legislation and proceed to put them into watertight legal form. So if you look at the UK or Canada or New Zealand, all those countries that have parliamentary systems very similar to the UK, they have many commissions composed of experts who actually draft legislation and decide on major issues and how to implement those issues in great detail. The question is, how do you select these people? 这个完全是从中国学的，因为不管是美国、法国、英国，19世纪之前，他们怎么选这些人，主要是靠一些家庭的背景。You know, they're from the aristocratic class， 都是贵族的背景，不一定是最优秀的，对不对？但是他们看一些美国的哲学家，you know， 所以一些西方的哲学家，Leibniz。Voltaire， 18世纪的时候，他们都看中国，哇，中国那么好的政治制度，他们觉得这些都是从科举的制度选这些很优秀的官员和统治者，当然统治者和官员分得不清楚，对不对？在中国，他觉得，我们也应该这么做。So。In the 1860s, 1860年代的时候， 他们改了那个怎么选这些官员的制度，慢慢来是通过考试的制度，这是完全是从中国学的 ，OK？ 所以有人说，那中国的软实力是什么呢？政治方面，这是最大的影响是用考试来选这些官员，就是完全是从中国学的。So John Stuart Mill, he also thought this was what the United Kingdom should do, and gradually the civil service was selected by examinations. And still today, in most countries in the West, examinations are used to select the civil servants. And elections are used to select the political leaders. 所以西方的分得很清楚，对不对？理论上，中国分得不清楚。我们晚上会讨论。Just to repeat, 理论上是这样的，实际上不一定，对不对？但是理论上，这是西方的代议制民主的制度。理论上，如果这些人虽然没有那么优秀，但是如果这些人很优秀，可以避免很多政策不好的问题。Okay. Now, what's the second problem of democracy? The second problem is a different one. It's basically majority rules, right? 大数的老百姓，他们可以选他们喜欢的领导，但是这些领导对少数民族可能有不好的影响，对不对？怎么避免这样的问题？这是非常非常重要的问题，而且20世纪的时候，还没有解决这些问题。现在很多国家还没有解决这些问题，包括现在的西班牙，对不对？How can you, if the rule of the majority can amount to class tyranny, how do you prevent that from happening? Well, he says you need special devices to represent minority voices. 需要给这些少数的声音，需要给他们一些方式来表达他们的声音。And very interesting, he opposes party politics. 他觉得他反对这个党制的政府。当然，这现在不管是英国、美国，所有的选举民主的国家都有 party politics， 对不对？ But he thought party politics is a bad thing because once you have parties, people will represent their interests, and the majority of people will represent their interests, and the minority of people will be consistently oppressed. 这些人会压迫少数。怎么避免呢？ Well, the first is you oppose party politics. 这跟20世纪的代议制民主完全不一样，对不对？这方面影响没有那么大。包括美国 the American founding fathers also opposed party politics for a very similar reason. It's a very big question now. 如果你们有兴趣写报告，这个问题非常重要的。为什么现在所有的代议制民主都有这个政党的政治？虽然很多哲学家都反对，为什么呢？这个问题也很值得研究。So how then can you represent minorities if you don't have party politics? Remember, he would oppose political parties that represent majorities and minorities because he thinks that it's very hard to change the system once you have. It's very hard for people to consider the common good if you have parties representing particular interests. Well, he suggests you need proportional, or what he calls personal representation. So minorities, if they have too small numbers to select their members, they can look elsewhere for candidates to obtain other votes. 是比较复杂的方式，但是他的意思是说，少数民族如果我在我的社群 if in my community I don't have enough people to represent my interests, I can collect votes from other areas, and then those minority views will be represented in parliament. Today, basically, because it's a party political system, you have two main systems in the West, right? One is, this is the British system, first past the post. 我不知道怎么翻译 first past the post. That means that if we are in a community, whoever the majority votes in our community for our representatives, that's who gets elected. It's very simple, first past the post. But you also have, this is the UK, it's still like that. But you also have proportional representation. Proportional representation means that even a minority of people can get elected. So you have countries like Germany, 德国、以色列、荷兰都有这样的制度。意思说，比如说，如果50%的老百姓会选一个人，这个人可以或者一个党，这个党有50%的代表。Okay, if for example, if you have 5% of people support my political party, then in the parliament, 5% of the deputies are from that political party. So this is a way of ensuring minority voices. John Stuart Mill didn't exactly support that system, but it was quite similar. Now, this is very interesting. John Stuart Mill, he favored universal suffrage. 他支持一人一票的制度，但是有一些限制。He said non-tax-paying citizens should not have the right to vote. Okay? If I pay no tax, it means that I don't have a sense of obligation or responsibility to my community. I just want everything for free, and I'm likely to be very selfish. So those who do not pay taxes should not have the right to vote. Because they might vote for extravagant government policies without having to pay for them. He says the unemployed shouldn't have the vote. Again, because they're likely to be selfish, he argues. If they can't support themselves by their own labor, they should not decide on the welfare of anyone else. And also, he says, illiterates, 文盲，他们也不应该有投票的权利，因为他们他们不够理性，主要是这个意思。So now today in Western 在西方的选举民主没有这些限制 ，OK？ 但是这方面 he was much more forward-looking. He wanted to include women. He was a member of parliament, and he was one of the very first members of parliament to argue that women should have the right to vote. It happened only 50 years later after he began, it happened quite a lot later, happened 50 years after he began to make this point. But he says, 不应该歧视, 他觉得男女政治方面应该是平等的情况. And this is a very interesting view. 他觉得怎么避免这些素质低的人怎么减少他们的政治的影响呢? He says, not everybody has the equal capacity to make informed political judgments, right? 不可以说每个人都有同意的能力来决定一些政治的问题。我已经说了，我讲虽然我爱我妈妈，但是他不会考虑这些政治的问题，所以他应该有平等的投票的权利呢？ John Stuart Mill 会说 No. More votes for the educated can prevent class legislation of the educated. If, for example, this is a bit simplifying what he said, but if you have master's degree 硕士生可以有应该是有比如说2个投票的权利，博士生3个投票的权利。通过类似的制度，可以避免这些素质低的人来决定他们的领导。所以他不完全支持一人一票的制度。他觉得最重要是我们要避免一些问题， 通过这些方式。So somebody who thinks of who defends democracy on natural rights view 大家都平等，而且就是平等的权利，不会这么想。但是因为他是功利主义者，他没有那么教条，他会发现哪种方式会导致最好的或者最多的幸福，最多的高级幸福。他可以改一人一票的制度，因为他是功利主义者 ，OK？ And this is very interesting too. He opposed the secret ballot. 他反对无记名投票，为什么呢？因为他觉得，如果完全是无记名的投票，我可以按照我的很自私的欲望来选我的代表，或者我可以比如说现在 ，Why did Donald Trump get elected? It's one very important reason is that there was a secret ballot. 很多人不承认我支持 Donald Trump， 因为他们知道他 they know that he's racist. 他们知道他歧视很多人。伊斯兰教的人、黑人等等，他们都知道他是这样的人，但是所以很多美国的老百姓不愿意公开说我支持 Donald Trump， 但是投票的时候，因为是无记名的制度，他们可以按照他们的欲望来投票。这个 John Stuart Mill 会觉得这个是非常糟糕的制度。So he said, if you vote, it should be performed 应该是公共的行动。You should vote in public, and you should be ready to defend your vote in public. Okay? 这样的可以避免这些坏人，或者表面上是好人，其实是坏人，可以避免这样的倾向。因为大家都知道 ，if I vote, I take responsibility for my vote. 我负责任，而且是公开负责任 ，open responsibility。当然，他承认如果有腐败的一些问题啊，或者有一些人会欺负别人。当然，如果是这样的情况的话，还需要无记名投票。但是如果没有腐败的问题，或者没有一些暴力的一些问题，应该是大家都是公开来选他们的领导 ，OK？ 他完全反对无记名投票。现在慢慢来，有一些学者还在讨论这个问题，但是现在西方的国家都会用无记名投票的制度，包括现在我们在善待，有时候我们要决定，我们还是用无记名投票的制度，很多东西，为什么呢？很值得讨论，对不对 ？John Stuart Mill 反对，很值得讨论。And this is very interesting too.他真的很有思想，因为当时大部分人没有那么担心或者太过分的爱国主义或者民族主义的问题，这是20世纪的最大的问题。但是19世纪的时候，已经他可以承认会有问题，而且完全用民主的制度不可以解决这个问题。He understood the principle of nationality is not in the utilitarian tradition. 功利主义者一般来说不会考虑这些爱国主义，他们觉得爱国主义和幸福没有什么关系。但是现在我们知道，很多人觉得我爱国，所以我幸福，所以爱国和幸福也有关系。这个 John Stuart Mill 承认这是一个问题。So utilitarians 他们这都有普世的一些欲望价值观，没有什么特殊的爱国主义啊，或者爱憎主义，或者一些特殊主义者。大部分的功利主义者，他们觉得不是一个问题。但是 John Stuart Mill 觉得是一个问题 ，OK？他觉得民族 the nation is the fundamental political unit， 是最基本的政治单位。 而且 he thinks you need to have a nation which is relatively homogeneous. You need the existence of a nation is a precondition for free institutions because you need some sort of coherent public opinion, which is very difficult if people are fundamentally divided. 如果有一个国家完全有不同的语言，完全有不同的历史与文化，不同的民族，没有什么共同的价值观，他觉得这样的国家很难有比较自由的一些或者比较民主的政治制度。Because people are just going to fight for their own narrow interests， 然后不会考虑国家的利益，他们就会考虑他们自己的小村的一些利益，对不对？ So he says, and this is, think about it now, in Spain, Catalonia, 这个问题非常严重。我的老家是加拿大，可能你们其实我在魁北克长大的，魁北克我们的母语是法语，不是英语，所以80年代的时候，90年代的时候，很多魁北克人想独立，为什么呢？因为他觉得我们跟这些加拿大人没有什么关系。他们不尊重我们的语言，我们的特殊文化，所以我们要独立。这个 John Stuart 非常担心这个问题，所以他觉得如果是太多元的文化，太多元的国家，会导致一些问题。OK？So John Stuart Mill 他当然反对，我要盲目爱我的民族，但是他承认大部分的民族、大部分的人民还需要自己的语言、自己的文化、自己的历史，他承认。所以怎么办呢？ Well, you have to mix nationalities, OK？ 要不同的民族认同，你可以一方面需要共同的语言，另一方面需要尊重不同的文化。但是如果是很小的民族，他觉得那要同化他们。OK， 现在很多西方的学者会反对，他觉得不应该同化少数民族，但是他觉得如果这些少数民族完全不愿意跟多数人交流，那他觉得没办法要同化他们。OK， 这是他的看法。但是现在大部分的西方学者不会用这样的语言。